Welcome everybody back for this afternoon's final session and panel discussion. We're continuing on through the relevant topics regarding the transition to alternative energy, and we'll be addressing the important question on this panel of electric transmission. And let me get it underway by reintroducing Professor Alex Klass, who you met this morning, who will moderate the panel and introduce the panelists, and I will step aside. Alex?
Here. So I know you thought you were done with me for today, but one more panel and then I'll be quiet. But I'm really excited to be moderating this panel on the electric transmission grid, which we have talked quite a bit about already in the morning sessions and even up till now. But this is the first panel that we have that is really focused in on the grid. We have some great panelists. We have three in person and one behind me on a very, very large screen. And you see their names listed on the slide. We have Jennifer Gardner, we have Masood Parvania, we have Matt Shapiro, and then Pilar Thomas. And I'm really excited to hear from all of them. Before I turn it over to Jennifer, and we are going to sort of go in the order that you see up there, I've got a few pictures and slides and thoughts just to kind of set the stage, because I recognize that people in the room are at sort of different levels of expertise when it comes to the electricity sector, energy law, those sorts of things. So first, just a little bit about the basics of electricity regulation in one slide. So under the Federal Power Act, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, this is back from the 1930s, is in charge of regulating wholesale sales of electricity, so that's sales for resale, so sales from a generator to a utility. Then the utility sells it at retail, to customers like all of us. So FERC is in charge of regulating and setting prices for wholesale sales of electricity in interstate commerce, and also the transmission of electricity in interstate commerce. So what's left for the states? A lot. States regulate retail sales and prices. They regulate the utilities in their jurisdiction as well, and also wholesale sales of electricity that are not in interstate commerce. And there are some. There is Hawaii and Alaska, which geographically seem obvious, and then there is Texas, which may not seem obvious. But most of Texas, as you'll see on some of these maps, intentionally does not transmit electricity in interstate commerce because it does not want to be regulated by the federal government. So the bulk of Texas is not subject to regulation by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission under the Federal Power Act. Okay, but this panel is about transmission lines. So how you build transmission lines is different from the sort of regulatory structure that I set out before. You might think that FERC is in charge of the siting and permitting of interstate electric transmission lines, right? They are in charge of siting and permitting for interstate natural gas pipelines, but they are not when it comes to electric transmission lines, because Congress has not given a federal agency that authority. It's either states or local governments that have almost exclusive jurisdiction over siting, the decision whether to put a transmission line in a particular place, and the permitting process if it's not on federal land. So this is true for generation facilities. States and local governments are in charge of that. And then when it comes to transmission lines that are not on federal lands, it is also the states, even if that transmission line crosses several states. There are narrow exceptions in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and also more recently in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, to give FERC what's called backstop siting authority. So if a state says no to a transmission line that's really important for national electricity needs, FERC can go in and approve that line. It has never done so, and these rules are still in development. If we're talking about energy generation facilities and portions of transmission lines that are on federal land, then it is the kind of Federal Land Management Agency, whether it's BLM or the Forest Service, who is in charge of that. So we have a lot of authority for the states, but there is still quite a bit of authority for the federal government as well. So here's our electric grid. Different size lines are shown in different colors. And then this morning, I think I showed you some of these slides. So this is another version of kind of the electric transmission system today and what we need to move towards decarbonization. And then there are sort of designs on what we could do to build a big high voltage direct current transmission line macro grid that could ship wind and solar across the country. And then I also showed you this slide this morning, specific lines that are in different stages of permitting that would actually help us get towards closer, at least, to that reality. This is NERC, is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. That is, this is a nonprofit entity. It's regulated by FERC, but it's in charge of electric grid reliability across the whole country. And you also see parts of North America that are not in the US, so parts of Canada and parts of Mexico as well. Now, these are RTOs. We've had some discussion of RTOs, but I don't think we've seen a map so far. And so these are sort of, again, nonprofit entities regulated by FERC that run wholesale electricity and capacity markets in certain parts of the country, and they also do the planning for regional transmission lines within their jurisdictions. You see there's a lot of areas in white, including the area that we are in right now in Utah, and these are areas where there are no regional transmission organizations. So there's no entity like MISO or Southwest Power Pool or PJM who are running these markets. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is the potential development of markets like this, particularly in the West and Intermountain West. This is the map of the Western Energy Imbalance Market. This is going to be a topic that Jennifer is going to talk about. And this is not quite an RTO, but it is sort of moving towards an RTO. And I'll let Jennifer talk more about that, but you'll see more of this. Some key orders, FERC orders and decisions that I think may be coming up in the presentations today. FERC is sitting on a regional transmission planning rule. There's a proposed rule out there to really accelerate regional transmission planning, which we have been very slow on. Any day now, we keep hearing from FERC, but we haven't seen it yet. Also, I mentioned backstop siting, where FERC can step in and issue a permit for an interstate electric transmission line that a state has said no to. There's a proposed rule out there. They have not finalized it yet. Order 745 and Order 2222 are key FERC orders. These actually exist right now and are finalized to better able demand response, distributed energy resources to participate in some of these RTO markets. You may hear about that later on the panel. And then I think this was mentioned perhaps during the last panel, Order 2023, which is ways to reform the generator interconnection problem, the idea of new wind and solar plants waiting for years in an interconnection queue to be able to reconnect, to connect to the grid. States fall into the category of either being traditionally regulated or restructured. Utah and many of its surrounding states are traditionally regulated, but in restructured states, there's much more focus in on these energy and capacity markets in RTOs because the utilities do not own, for the most part, do not own generation. And one of the presentations today is going to talk about integrated resource planning. So what that is state public utility commissions and state public service commissions. Those are the same thing. It's just they're called different things in different states. In traditionally regulated states like Utah, they require utilities to submit plans for review or approval for new generation facilities needed to meet customer load forecasts. So the utility goes in with a plan that says, this is what we want to build and buy over the next few years in order to make sure we can serve all of our customers. In restructured states, these are the ones that are in the green, there really isn't a integrated resource planning process. Instead, these RTO these RTO regions do capacity markets. So you have a market to come up, make sure there's going to be enough generation available. And Matt Shapiro is going to be talking about the role of new transmission lines in utility integrated resource planning processes, which is why I mention it now. And I think now we move to Jennifer.
All right. Thank you, Alex, for that wonderful intro. Before I start going into my slides that I prepared for today, I just want to do a little bit of level setting. And I know we've heard a lot today about the need for more infrastructure in this country to meet our clean energy goals, whether it be more renewable energy, more storage, or more transmission. But I'm just going to throw some more statistics at you because why not? We're at the end of the day. I think we've heard a little bit about the DOE National Transmission Needs Study, which was released last year, but I just want to highlight some of the stats that came out of that and the need for transmission that was identified in that study. So it found that there was, an urgent need for additional transmission infrastructure in nearly all regions, including the United States. The reasons for this are because we need to improve not only reliability of our grids, but resiliency, so being able to stand up to extreme weather events, for example, but also to address increasing energy costs, as well as to reduce transmission congestion and constraints. Specifically, the U.S. needs to more than double existing regional transmission capacity and expand the interregional transmission capacity by more than 5-fold. So this is no easy feat, because as we've heard from earlier conversations today, these lines are taking anywhere from 10 to 20 years to build. In fact, one of our morning keynotes talked about the average time being 10 years. In the West, the average time is closer to 20 years or longer for these larger lines. So the time is definitely of the essence. Speaking of high energy costs, there was an article this week that was reflecting takeaways from a report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it said that US electricity prices rose 3.6% over the last 12 months, which is outstripping the broader inflation rate of 3.2%. This is being linked to not only transmission costs, but also volatile fuel prices. So even though there's this clear need for more transmission infrastructure, the construction of new high voltage lines, which we're going to define as anything above 230 kV, it went from a peak of 4,000 miles of high capacity lines in 2013 to less than 250 miles of those same sized lines in 2021. So at the same time we're needing to see an increase, we're actually seeing a decrease. I think we're obviously starting to see a reversal of that trend, but I just again want to do some level setting on sort of how dire the need is for these transmission lines. So let's go to my first slide. Get another map of the West, and this is a map of the 38 different balancing authorities that we have in the West today. Now, this number is honestly kind of always changing. Sometimes I check in with WEC, the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, which is based here in Salt Lake, and they're like, oh yeah, we have 37, sometimes it's 39. I'm just going to assume for today's purposes that we're at 38, but again, don't quote me on that. But each of these footprints is represented by a different utility in the West. And so I bring this up because I really think that this map, maybe more than any other map that I could show you of the West, shows you how balkanized our planning framework is in the West. This is important for purposes of transmission planning because, as Alex alluded to, outside of California, we don't have an organized market framework in the West outside of the energy imbalance market. That market, which if I had more time today, I could explain to you how it works. It is wonderful at integrating renewable energy and reducing renewable energy curtailments. What it doesn't do is give us coordinated transmission planning across that huge footprint. It also doesn't give us a transmission cost allocation methodology for these large scale lines that are incredibly expensive to build. So what's nice about RTOs, that's one of the services they provide. Beyond integrating renewables and reducing energy costs for customers, they also provide those frameworks for transmission planning and transmission cost allocation. So without that in the West, we get these 38 utility balancing authorities that are trying to build transmission in some type of coordinated fashion. They have regional planning groups that they participate in, and that's helpful. It gets us organized, it gets some plans out. But I think to underscore sort of the lack of success of this existing paradigm, we haven't built any regional or interregional lines as a result of this planning process. So it's not working like it was designed to. So we've already heard about some of the policies that have come out of FERC, and Alex already touched upon the Regional Transmission Planning NOPR, which was actually issued back in 2022. We're still waiting on that final rule. I bring this up because I think in the West, it's something that a lot of advocates at least are really looking forward to, because what it tries to do, what we're hoping it will do, is improve upon the Order 1000 regional transmission planning process that's been in place since 2011. That process, as I alluded to on the former slide, has not led to a lot of positive change in terms of building these new larger scale transmission lines that we need. So the sooner we can get a final rule in place and put some pressure on the regional planning groups to do more than they're doing today, the better. I just want to underscore a couple of things that, if we get a robust final rule that builds upon the draft rule, essentially, what we might be getting. One of those things would be this requirement that regional planning groups and the transmission planners in those groups have a longer term outlook in terms of transmission needs. So right now they're looking around like the 10-year mark, right? And 10 years is fine, but we want a longer outlook, 20 years, even further if we can, to really identify those larger scale lines that we need to bring renewables to load centers. It also wants to make sure that transmission cost allocation agreements can actually be coordinated between not only utilities, but states. There's a real desire to bring states to the table here and have their input early on so that when they see proposals in front of them, they can be confident in approving those proposals. I won't talk about right of first refusal at length. Feel free to ask questions later if you want. But what I will say is that in Order 1000, FERC had eliminated the right of first refusal for incumbent utilities to build their lines. And then in the NOPR has indicated that they will sort of give that right of first refusal back, but in limited circumstances, there has to be a partnership between a utility and somebody else to build a line to be able to be eligible for that, what we call a ROFR, essentially. Also, there's some increased transparency and coordination requirements. So because we lack this RTO, because we're waiting on this final rule from FERC, the West, what I want to give us credit for is we're so good at filling in gaps where they exist. We love to come together, we love to form coalitions and try to solve our problems. It doesn't always work, but I love that we keep trying. So we've got quite a few initiatives that are underway at various stages, and I just want to talk about two of them. And in the Q&A session, I might be able to bring up some more examples for you as well. There's a lot happening in the transmission space, and again, this is only two efforts. The first is the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition. It's called WestTech. Alex and I were joking before the panel started about how many acronyms are in our industry. So it's not my fault. I did not come up with these acronyms, but I'm going to try to explain them to you as much as I can. So what I think is really interesting about this initiative is that it's a bunch of utilities from across the West that came together and said, hey, we agree, like this transmission is needed, we need more of it. And the utilities that started this are actually in the Northwest, but they started partnering with utilities throughout the West, including the Intermountain West where we are. And they said, we know we need more. We know the current planning process isn't working. They're acknowledging it, which is great. We see that no regional projects are being built under the current process. We see that forward-looking planning is really limited. We're not doing 20-year outlooks. And we agree that interregional planning is just not taking place. So we want to do something about that. So this all kicked off in fall of 2023, so about 6 months ago. What they're proposing to do is producing not only a 10-year transmission outlook, so what's needed in the 10-year time frame, but also what's needed in the 20-year time frame. And they put a lot of emphasis on creating an actionable transmission plan. What actionable means depends on who you ask, but according to the WestTech organizers, they really want to ensure that the data that's being fed into these models, which then produce the outputs that give us transmission plans, is as accurate as possible and is taking into account as many data points as necessary, including public policy goals of every single state in the West. It's also going to consider a wider category of benefits than some of these utilities have maybe considered in the past. I have those listed there on the slide, and I'm not going to go into too much detail in the interest of time. Thank you. But what I do want to say here is that there was a resounding emphasis on the need for state and tribal engagement in this process. Tribal engagement has not been robust in the past in some of these transmission planning processes, and there was this real desire to bring them to the table. I can talk more about the governance framework for this effort in the Q&A portion, but we are running out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead. The next big initiative that I wanted to talk about is another study initiative. And I feel like we love studying things in the West too, beyond forming coalitions. We love studies. But what I want to do is distinguish this study from the one I just talked about. This study was actually spearheaded by a bunch of essentially environmental NGOs. Environmental NGOs, clean energy advocates, they went to Grid Lab, which is also a nonprofit that provides technical services to NGOs throughout the country, and said, hey, we think we need a study that looks at transmission needs that are necessary to meet a highly decarbonized future in 2045. So it's a very specific look at the year 2045 and what we need to get there. They're going to be examining a broader category of benefits than what we saw in the West Tech effort. Those are, again, listed on the slide, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'm really excited about the study and what it could potentially tell us. They did release preliminary findings, last month. And I will say some of these findings are a little terrifying to me because they show us just how maybe at this point, even that we're projecting low what we actually need to meet the increases in demand that are coming our way. So let's talk a little bit about what Connected West is showing. So first, load. The WEC system will experience unprecedented load growth levels under a high electrification future. And on that point, I just want to underscore a New York Times article that I think came up in the Q&A earlier today. But it said that over the past year, utilities have nearly doubled their estimates of how much additional power they'll need by 2028, which is not that far off from now. That's due to an increase in data centers, the amount of electric vehicles we're seeing, as well as increased manufacturing, specifically tied to solar and EV facilities in this country. So that load is just increasing exponentially, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. Generation, the capacity will more than double from 2032 to 2045 to meet demand. Not surprisingly, we're going to see most of those increases in renewable energy. In these preliminary findings, they're seeing a 4 times increase in renewable energy resources, as well as a very large increase in storage resources. For the transmission forecast, which is that third box on the screen, it will assume an unprecedented level of transmission investment between now and 45. This will represent 5,300 miles and $27 billion of new transmission investment. So very significant. I want to also note that despite the amount of transmission that's envisioned to meet the needs of this study, they're still seeing significant curtailments of renewable energy. And this kind of ties into the constraints, which is that last box. The study engineers who are actually performing this work acknowledge that they're probably underestimating the total transmission need, just given the factors that went into the study and all of the different reasons that are creating a higher demand for transmission in the West. So I know I've run out of time. I will stop there and just say one last remark. So absent a more robust organized market framework in the West, we are seeing lots of different initiatives like this, whether it be studies or coalitions forming, trying to come together and actually fill that gap, identify the transmission need, and try to spearhead new transmission development in the West. Only time will tell if it will be successful, and I'm happy to elaborate more in Q&A. Thank you so much.
You want to go first? Okay. And now we have Masood Parvania.
Good afternoon, everybody. I have the news is that I have few more map of the West, but they are different. So I'm going to talk about resilience. I'm an engineer. I'm a professor at the U, electrical and computer engineering. We work on the grid, modeling the grid. So a little bit different context. So hopefully that's not going to be boring for you. This is what we call billion-dollar maps. How many of you have you seen this? So these are maps that are shown, that are published every year by NOAA, that basically shows all the major events, major natural disaster, extreme weather events that happen across the country that cost more than $1 billion damage in cost to the society. It's not just power outage cost, but I mean cost to the whole society. So in the past, it's been mostly very heavy on the east, right? So like we have always had like these hurricanes that have like basically gathered the focus, and then the term resilience basically came from the fact that we wanted to make sure that the Florida doesn't go under the Florida doesn't lose power after we get some of this hurricane down there, right? But it's been in the past few years, West has been the focus. So we see more and more of these events happening in the West, and they are not, of course, hurricanes, right? So we get the heat wave almost every year, and they are hotter, and they last longer when they happen. And of course, we get the wildfire again every year. So these are two maps for 2021 and 2022, and you can simply like search for like $1 billion map, and you can find for every year, in the last 30 years. So I want to bring like two examples. These are two more map of the West. So these are the temperature of two specific days in 2020 and 2022. So one is August 18, 2020, and September 6, 2022. So as you can see, there are these days, time of the day, that the whole West is almost above 100 degree. So that is not easy for the power grid. This is the power grid in the West has been always one of the most reliable grids in the world, but we see not only the fact that the load is changing, the generation mix is changing, but also we have the problem that the temperature is changing. So we have like hotter days, and those hotter days last longer, and that lasting longer is also important. It's not just one day, but it takes like 10 days. We are like the whole thing is taking longer, and that's also important. So as you can see, they are different. They happen in different parts of the West. So so in 2020 you don't see like in this area, but then 2022 you also see here, and also it happens like farther in the like closer to fall in September 6th. In September 6th, you are not supposed to have that kind of weather in the West. So that is not easy for the power grid. So and these are two metrics. WEC measures these, and these are called EEAs and energy emergency alerts that WEC publishes, and that EEA3 is basically that alert that is published when there is an outage in one of the balancing authorities. And as you can see in this like Q3, which is basically coincides with these like two seasons that we are studying here, 2020 and 2022, we have more, basically we have like more events happening, number of these basically alerts, and also the average duration of those. And these are outages that is happening in the West. So it's not basically, it's not that it's not affecting. It is affecting, and it's reflected in this reliability standard that WEC publishes. So what do we do about that? Of course, the solution is to think about the fact that load is changing, the generation is changing, and we have these. We need to study not just the resource change, not just the fact that we need to build more transmission, but also we need to think about the fact that the weather is also changing. So it's not the same land, it's not the same climate. We need to make sure that all those future plans are also resilient against this. And resilience is not really, is totally different from reliability. Again, you know that, but reliability is really like when you have a car and like the car breaks down sometimes, right? Because that's a physical equipment. But resilience is something that is an external event is affecting that. How to resist that? How to be resilient against that external event that is like way beyond the capacity of what the grid can tolerate. So that is basically the scope that we see here, and I want to bring the attention that resilience is important. So it's planning for more renewable is important. Planning transmission for that, but also planning transmission that is resilient is different and is important. So the question, following up what Jennifer said. So what can markets help, right? So as Jennifer said, we don't have an organized market across the West, right? But we only have California ISO. But in the past, 10 years, we have done the Western Energy Imbalance Market that has helped, right? That has helped to, in real time, which is not delivering the most benefit, in real time, try to connect resources, try to bring resources together to help the grid. And that's, if you go to a website, there's a website that basically tracks the quarterly benefit that and cost savings to all of these participating utilities. You see that like over the past 10 years, $5 billion there has been savings. But what they don't track, the benefit for resilience, right? So can these markets that we are running, which is mostly like the benefit is like seen as the being the savings for the utility, can they also help with the resilience? That's the question. Just a few months ago, and back in December, FERC approved the extended day ahead market that California's ISO is going to run in the next few years. And so that is going to help. You do like a coordination in day ahead that is going to deliver way more benefit, right? But again, so how is that going to help with for the resilience? That's a question, because when you have a problem of like a heat wave, right, that is like impacting the whole generation mixes and increasing the load, can the market still help on that situation? So this is kind of showing how may impact, right? It affects almost every aspect of the grid, right? Higher temperature, transformers don't work as they should. Transmission lines impacts the ratings of them, and also storage is not as the same as, it doesn't have the same capacity. Also, all kind of renewable energy, they don't basically generate as usual in higher temperature. We all know like what happens to it, like thermal units, and of course that also impacts the load. So we all, when it's above 100 degrees, we all have the AC running full time, right? That's impacting the demand. So at the same time that the generation is decreasing, that's the stress that is happening on the grid. And again, we all know that that's impacted prices too. That impacts the prices too. So the question is that how this coordination across the West through these two types of market, real-time market and day-ahead market, can help and provide some relief during those situations. So FERC 22, what I want to basically talk about here is that it's not just transmission, right? When we are talking about the markets, FERC 22 basically enables the distributed resources, the distribution system also participate in the markets. It's not just a larger scale generation that can participate. These can also participate. But the question is that, but the problem again is that, the distributed energy resources are scattered in this distribution system. So we don't have basically, it's not just simply a summation of those resources that we can deliver to the transmission grid, right? Because there is constraint there is load there, the resources have the constraints, of course the network has the constraint. So we've been working on these models that we call it deliverable energy flexibility. Basically, that there is that energy flexibility that the distribution system can provide to the transmission network, and that's different from energy. So what we usually have from the generation resources participating in the market is energy, right? But the distribution system in total, they provide energy flexibility, which is different. It's basically the difference between what they do as in business as usual, with the situation that they actually control. They want to actively change their generation to participate in the market. So for that, technology comes in, right? How do we enable that? How do we enable the participation of these distributed energy resources in the markets? They are not just one control knob to control and go up and down to participate in the market, right? There are thousands of them in a distribution system. In summation, we want to deliver some flexibility, right? So for that, so we've been developing some AI controllers that actually controls in real time all those resources to enable the participation of those in the market. So for that, we do this zoning and develop one AI controller for each of those zones that then in summation controls everything together to participate in the market. So these are all some of the researches that we've been doing in my lab at the University of Utah. And just recently, we were awarded this large grant by a National Science Foundation and NSERC in Canada to establish what we call US-Canada Center on Climate Resilience Western Interconnected Grid, Wired Global Center, that includes 11 different universities across the Western US and Canada. And University of Utah is leading it in the US, and University of Calgary is leading it in Canada. And that brings together all the major power engineering like groups that are working on the topic, but not just that. The data scientists and atmospheric scientists and climate modelers who all work together to solve this problem. We need more climate modeling in the power grid. We need more atmospheric science practices in the power grid. When you ask like a utility, what do you envision the heat wave is going to be 10 years from now, they have a vague answer for that, right? And how that is going to impact their operating planning practices, that's again even more vague. So that's what we are trying to do here, and we have like almost 15 different utilities across the West being part of us, and WEC and some other agencies. So this is kind of like one of the like services that we are providing at the moment. We have created this what we call climate and grid data cyber infrastructure. That is a combination of many models and many data sets that many groups that are part of our team are providing to collect all of them at the same infrastructure to be able to deliver those services to the utility partners. And this is like some my lab that we try to kind of bring all of those modeling tools that we have, but also test them on a hardware in the loop simulation test, but to be able to show that these are not just like some academic models, but also they can work in practice. So this is like some QR code to see the website, and thank you.
Okay. So now we move to Matt Shapiro, our voice from the sky. There he is up on the screen. And Matt, why don't you get started and tell me when you want me to move the slides.
Hey, sound check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here virtually. Sorry I couldn't make it in person. I am Matthew Shapiro, CEO of rPlus Hydro. And we're going to talk a little bit about integrated resource planning, which Alex touched on earlier, and how transmission plays a role in many of those plans. We keep an eye on, as a developer, we keep an eye on integrated resource plans because they're a very rich source of information about utilities, assumptions about resource needs, resource costs, and characteristics, and their future plans for balancing their portfolio to meet a variety of requirements. So let us move to the next slide. So there are major transmission projects showing up in utility resource plans. I created the slide, so I should have it memorized, but I have to check and see. Yes. So as was noted earlier, there are many different balancing authorities across the US, and quite a few of those are situations where you have a utility who is the load serving entity, who is also the balancing authority, who is also the owner of transmission. So they're sort of traditional vertically integrated, and part of their job is not only thinking about what new power plants to acquire and generation sources to build, as well as energy conservation and demand side resources, but also new transmission. So some of the biggest examples, and we've seen some major initiatives over the past several years, PacifiCorp with their gateway projects, Gateway West, Gateway South, Gateway Central. We have NV Energy with its GreenLink project. We have the Power Pathways project in Colorado, which Xcel Energy is developing, and Idaho Power, along with PAC with their Boardman to Hemingway line, along with others, other smaller projects. So these provide some really good examples, and we can go to the next slide. So these are multi-year, multi-billion-dollar transmission initiatives that are that have been in resource planning cycles. They usually go to two or 3 year resource planning cycles, and they're actually having to provide more frequent updates now because things are changing so quickly. But this map is to give you an idea of some of the geographic scope of these projects. The Green Link project is a 500 kV, predominantly 500 kV project in Nevada with a major line in the north and going from the sort of mid-east part of the state to the Reno area, and then another line connecting southern Nevada with the Reno area to create this loop. These utilities, in the case of Nevada, it was originally two separate utilities who joined up. So the northern and southern grids were never really strongly interconnected. So this is part of the evolution of their system after they became one company. And we'll get into the rationale behind that a little bit. Boardman to Hemingway is a major initiative to link up the Pacific Northwest system with Idaho for multiple purposes that we'll touch on in the next slide. The Gateway project is...
Do you want me to switch slides or not?
Not quite yet. The Gateway project links Wyoming. So Pacific Corp has the biggest territory, including stretching from Wyoming to Utah and over to Oregon and through Idaho. So that project links up the Wyoming wind resource with the core load center in Utah, and Gateway West crosses over into Idaho and links up with the B2H project. And then the Power Pathways project in Colorado is in the southeast part of the state, and it's a big loop in an area heavy in solar and wind development. So we can get to the reasons in the next slide. Thank you. So the rationale is multiple purposes for these utilities, and they have to justify this in their resource plans. There is the purpose of capacity, and a more outstanding example, I would say, for that is the Boardman to Hemingway project, which Idaho Power began socializing in its resource planning quite a few years ago, interestingly, as a capacity resource. So in lieu of saying we'd like to build a gas-fired power plant, we are proposing to build this transmission line. Although, as we all know, transmission itself is not a capacity resource. The argument was that there's lots of energy in the Pacific Northwest that they can import, and that the transmission line itself comprises the reliable way to get it delivered to Idaho's service territory, and that all of this energy will be available for them to purchase. We have the rationale of facilitating renewables and decarbonization, which really all of them do touch on, but in varying degrees. So Gateway South is clearly oriented around delivering about 2,000 megawatts of Wyoming wind, high quality, low cost Wyoming wind energy to the core load center in Utah. And the Power Pathway, similar purpose to gather large amounts of solar and wind energy and deliver that to the core load centers. So, and that's to meet requirements for decarbonization and major planned acquisitions of wind and solar resources. And then reliability plus renewables. So Green Link is really hitting both. They're moving renewable energy around the state in the most efficient way with two load centers, being Reno and Las Vegas, and the solar that is being built out being located all across the state. The southwest corner of the state seeing a huge amount of solar development. Southern, somewhat, but slowing down, and then a lot in the northeast as well. So being able to move that power around to meet the load requirements in a state that has a 50% renewable energy target requirement by 2030, and then goals to hit 100% by 2045, that transmission system is integral to the case. Next slide, please. So PUC approvals, as I mentioned, these are all multi-billion-dollar, very long-term projects that the ratepayers will be paying for. The public utility commissions that approve those plans have been generally supportive of transmission. They seem to get the argument that building transmission is a key to facilitating the decarbonization role, and that sometimes can replace building new power plants, or at least conventional power plants. And so they have been approving these projects. I think that may be my last slide. Yep. Thank you.
It is. Thank you. All right. And then last, we have Pilar Thomas, who will take us in a different direction.
Not that different, but I will sit here. Do you want me to use the? Yeah, that'll be easier. That way I don't have to go. Next slide.
Yep.
Although that is a conversation filler. So my name is Pilar Thomas. I'm a partner in the law firm of Quarles and Brady, I'm based out of Tucson, Arizona. The firm's based out of Milwaukee. I'm also a professor of practice at both the University of Arizona and Arizona State University. So I'm an equal opportunity professor when they get their duel in the desert, I go whatever. But I teach Indian energy law, and I spend probably about 2 of my classes just talking about transmission, because as we like to say, great that you got all this power, solar, wind, biomass, geothermal out in Indian country, but if you can't get it to market, it is your most fatal of all fatal flaws. So I'm going to kind of try and weave what we've already heard, but talk about it from an Indian country perspective. Because if you notice, there was only one slide that said the word tribes, and none of the maps actually had any maps of Indian country on it. Just why this is important, National Renewable Energy Lab did a study in 2013, which has since been updated, but in that study, they did a technical analysis of the kind of technically feasible renewable resources across the whole country. They've, of course, done a lot more further up studies around solar and wind in particular. But we had them, I was at the Department of Energy at the time, we had them pull out Indian country. And an interesting statistic was that 2% of the lands in this country are considered Indian land, but 5% of the renewable resources are on Indian land. So an outsized amount of renewable resources, primarily because they're very underdeveloped or very rural. But solar capacity alone in Indian country is enough to power the United States 2 times over. So huge opportunity to leverage Indian country's clean resources, clean energy resources, to meet the net zero, the net carbon emission reduction, the clean, whatever you want to term you want to use. And so one of the challenges that I have working with my clients, working with others, and teaching and just job owning the Department of Energy and others is don't forget the tribes. Don't forget Indian country. And yet we still have a challenge even just putting pictures of them on the maps. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just 3 major areas. One is the intersection of planning and Indian lands. We've heard a lot about the federal planning, the regional planning, the state level planning. And so what do we see incorporating tribes, if at all, in that planning effort? Some of the more recent transmission policy that we see, both in terms of money and in terms of kind of changing policy positions and what those effects are high level on Indian tribes. And then finally, just thinking about some transmission development opportunities for tribes in the industry. So at least with respect to the intersection of transmission and planning, very, again, high level, Department of Energy has got, I don't know how many national transmission planning efforts underway. They've got a needs plan and a plan and energy corridor plan and a whole bunch of stuff like that. And they have, at least in this administration, been very open and made a lot of effort to engage tribes. But they've been very limited. They've been very focused on particular handful of tribes. So they've left a good number of tribes out. In a couple of ways. One, they don't really do that good of an outreach. And 2, this stuff is complicated. I mean, we got PhDs and, people who do this stuff for a living who still don't understand it. So, right, Jennifer?
Yes.
So the challenge that we have is we don't understand it, but we've got to educate folks on how we do that. So I'll cut the DOE a little bit of slack, but they have gotten very pointed comments that where are your Indian country maps? They've just put out their national needs study, still not a map with tribal lands on it. No reference to Indian country generation. They put a couple of paragraphs in, but nothing that said, look at all these tribes in the middle of the country. You saw the wind map earlier. Half of that's Indian country. So, no effort to get Indian wind off of the Dakotas, the Oceti-Sakowin, which stands for the Great Sioux Nation, has got a power authority where they're trying to develop 2 to 3 gigawatts of wind power and not a transmission planner in sight to help them figure out how to get it off of the plains into Minneapolis, for example. So we have a huge gap in information and understanding that's happening at the national level. The energy corridors as well, they've revised some of those. That was a big 2005 effort. There's a little bit of revision that happens here and there. We kind of forget about it because it's happening over at a lab in Chicago, but still limited tribal outreach and gaps. I'll show you an example in just a minute. The FERC rules, so we've got regional planning. FERC's getting a little bit better at tribal outreach, but again, no effort to bring tribes into their regional planning rule. What additional considerations should we have for folks who are trying to do projects on or near Indian lands, whether it's economic projects or environmental impacts, et cetera? We've got the backstop. They do have provisions in the backstop rule about engaging with tribes if you're going to try and get a eminent domain to get your transmission line done. The interconnection rule that we just heard about, 2023. No consideration for tribal projects in that interconnection process. So still some gaps there. And then state-based planning, there is zero. I don't know a single state that has brought tribes into the conversation of state-based planning, and that has a real impact. See SunZia, who the Bureau of Land Management is now being sued by Tohono and San Carlos Apache for approving the SunZia line, portion of which is running through the last wilderness in Arizona, the San Pedro Valley, and destroying cultural resources as we speak, because BLM failed to do an environmental review. Now, granted, it's not on BLM lands, but the state didn't do it either. State of Arizona has siting authority. They never engaged the tribes in permitting that transmission line. They don't have a requirement to engage the tribes. And so now, I think last week was the hearing, no, it was yesterday, was the hearing on a preliminary injunction. So while SunZia doesn't have to defend this, of course they've intervened, but this is what happens when you don't have tribes in at the beginning. They will hold stuff up. Tribes have killed projects, and if we don't bring them in the beginning, then it will happen, and I don't know if it'll happen to SunZia, but is anybody here from SunZia before I say something? So let me just say this, somebody from SunZia made this very public comment, so this is not confidential information. They told an energy conference that they purposefully avoided tribal lands in their route. On purpose. We did not want to deal with the Indian tribes, is literally what he said out loud. So I will say, does not look good on your industry when that's your take. But states and the federal government do have a responsibility to bring tribes in. The federal government, because they're our trustee. They have a trust relationship with tribes. They have a government-to-government relationship with tribes, as do the states. So that's just some thoughts on planning. At least with respect to, here's an example of a energy corridor gap. So the red on this is the corridor. This is a Department of Energy map. The orange on this is the Pyramid Lake Paiute Reservation in northern Nevada. And as you can see, there's a gap. Like they literally end the corridor at the reservation line and they pick it up on the other side of the reservation line. There are maps like this all over the West. There's a map like this for the Colorado River Indian Tribe. There's a map like this for the Navajo Nation. There's a map like this for the Tohono O'odham Nation. So it's kind of hard to understand how we're supposed to bring tribes into this effort when you just put a gap there. Okay, recent policy and effects on tribes. So massive federal funding for transmission now, billions and billions of dollars. The professor here talked about distributed energy. We've got these grid formula grants that deal mostly with distributed energy, distribution lines, and upgrading those, hardening those. Tribes receive money for that. They're part of the formula grant. The GRIP program, which is kind of bigger grid. Here's an example of how you can work with a tribe. Warm Springs, Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs in northwest Oregon, just outside of Portland, partnered with Portland Gas on a $250 million transmission line upgrade that will allow the tribe to bring in solar and wind power into Portland. And so they've joined forces to do that. One of the reasons they had to do that is because that Boardman-Hemingway line that was discussed last time purposefully avoided Warm Springs. When they were planning that line, Warm Springs said, we want you to come on our reservation. We have renewable energy resources we want to bring to the market. And the company said, nope. And they went right around, they literally went 40 miles out of their way to go around the reservation. So they partnered now with Portland Gas. The transmission facilitation program is an opportunity to get capacity rights, which helps with financing projects, and tribes are eligible for this. The Siting and Economic Development Program, they've got about $500 million, almost $500 million to help tribes and other local governments with some of the siting and environmental work that has to be done, including developing economic development programs as part of how do we make transmission more equitable, right? How do we make access to transmission or the transmission lines themselves? Because as we saw in all the maps, they literally go from Wyoming to southern Nevada with no stops basically in between. The discussion around HVDC lines, which are super highways, I call them the world's longest Gentile lines. They literally go from the generation to the load, and nothing in between can get on them or get off of them because they're incredibly expensive. So what do those kinds of lines mean to the lands over which those lines are going, and nobody's getting the benefit of that line? I can't put power on it. I can't take power off of it. So Philip Anschultz, I know he runs right down here, the middle of Utah, came right through the Utah Utes Reservation. They tried to do a deal so that they could get on the line. Nope, sorry, DC. So I can't get on it. So we have these kinds of HVDC lines developing all over the place. So these economic development efforts are another critical consideration. But there are obstacles to gathering that. I've talked about mentioned the FERC order. One of the key challenges we're seeing now, tribes are trying to do their own development around renewable energy. They're now encountering the new FERC 2023 order with the expensive cluster studies and the expensive lines of credit to stay in the queue. So no real carve out or consideration for projects that are located on tribal lands that are frankly subject to tribal jurisdiction. And I would argue not subject to FERC jurisdiction, but that's a fight for another day with FERC. And then the Western RTO mentioned tribes, but even in that map, we still didn't see, there were a lot of blank spots. Those blank spots were tribal utilities. Navajo Utility Authority, not in the discussion. Tohono O'odham Utility Authority, not in the discussion. Not part of the energy imbalance market either. So it's not just the tribes themselves, but it's even tribal power users, especially the utilities. Okay, let me end with some opportunities. So much for the razor blade speech. Let me talk about what we can maybe do a little bit differently. So we've got three models that tribes are looking at as they think about not just how do I get my power to market, but maybe how do I get into the transmission game itself. So the first one I'll call the Morongo model. In Southern California, there's a tribe, the Morongo Band of Cahuilla Indians. They're based outside of Palm Springs. Anybody been to Palm Springs? Handful. So you know all the big windmills that are right out there, and then if you're driving from Palm Springs into Los Angeles, you drive through a gap. Morongo sits right in the middle of that gap. Southern California Edison had to upgrade a power line coming from the deserts, the desert center, which is a massive solar production area, into California. And they needed to upgrade that power line and expand their right-of-way on Morongo's land. And Morongo said no. So it took them about 5 years of negotiation, but finally they came to a deal where Morongo bought into the line. So they invested some money, a lot, and received capacity rights. Morongo now owns half of that power line with capacity rights for just like literally about 3 miles of right-of-way through the Morongo Reservation. But the estimate is that they will receive almost $1 billion in benefits for what would otherwise have been a $5,000 right-of-way payment. So we call that the Morongo model. There are now transmission line companies that are actually looking to do the same kind of thing with other tribes throughout the West, where they are offering the tribes, rather than a simple right-of-way payment, if you want to buy in on the line, let's talk about an ownership opportunity on that transmission line. The other model, the Trans-West, I call it the Trans-West model. It's my own Gentai line from generation directly to load. And there are a lot of tribes, again, Oceti-Sakowin, where they've got 2 or 3 gigawatts of wind power that they can coordinate amongst several reservations in the Dakotas, but own one power line that moves it just straight to Minneapolis. Don't pass go, don't look for Basin to interconnect you, don't look to WAPA to interconnect you, just send it straight there, just like Mr. Anschultz has done. Can be done. And then lastly, the typical merchant transmission line model, right? Where I build and I either own or I then sell it off on merchant transmission. And we see a lot of those, especially all over the West right now. So those are some other key opportunities to kind of marry massive renewable energy resources with transmission development opportunities to just own it beginning to load. And so I think, is that it? My last one? That's it. So with that, thank you.
Okay, great, everyone. So we have almost a half an hour for Q&A, right? I'm checking with the bosses over there, right? We've got till 5 o'clock. Okay, good. So I have a couple of questions for the panelists, and then I will open it up to the very good audience questions that are coming in on the computer screen here. So this is a question for everyone. So, and sort of quick answers, 2 or 3 sentences, if you can. So there's been some mention of quite a bit of provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So for each of you, what are the most impactful provisions, you can only use, let's say I'll give you a maximum of 2, that is most impactful for your work sort of now and in the immediate future. So, and I'll just, how about I'll go this way and then the next question I'll come back the other way. So Jennifer.
Great, thanks. And we've already heard a little bit about it. I'll be really brief, but the Transmission Facilitation Program, which is a $2.5 billion, essentially a revolving loan program, revolving fund program for transmission lines, I think has been incredibly impactful, and that was created through the IIJA. We have a couple of project winners in the first round of funding in the West, which have benefited from it. The Cross Tie project, which is from Nevada to Utah, as well as the South Line project from Arizona to Mexico. So essentially, DOE is committing to purchasing a percentage of the total proposed capacity of those lines via capacity contract, which reduces the overall risk for those particular developers in those circumstances. So I think that one's been hugely impactful.
Great. Masood?
I would say the GRIP program, resilience, of course. So that's been one of the biggest opportunities for the utilities to spend on areas that is not necessarily paid by taxpayer or they can't get an approval for, and that those requirements that include like 40% justice 40% of benefits should go to like underrepresented communities and others. That's been helping. So we partnered with Pacific Core. Pacific Core just received 2 of that. They're the only one in the nation who received 2 that basically like is just for wildfire and many other projects that they are doing, and that includes like in one of the projects almost 100% is on the areas like underrepresented communities, and that's improving wildfire in those communities like basically situation for wildfire resilience in those communities. So to me, that's one of the most impactful one. That's $4.5 billion, and the next round is actually ongoing right now.
Okay. Matt, your favorite?
Well, in my work, the investment tax credit and the Inflation Reduction Act has been a game changer. 30% basically minimum in investment tax credit, plus another 10% bonus for domestic content, which our types of projects will almost certainly qualify for, and another 10% bonus tax credit for being in an energy community. And many of our projects are located in energy communities. So we're looking at up to 50% investment tax credit, which helps balance out the effects of inflation a little bit.
Great. Pilar?
I'm going to say the elective pay part of the Inflation Reduction Act, which allows applicable entities defined to include tribal governments and tribal enterprises to get a payment equal to the tax credit amount. So the 50% that you could stack, if it's smaller, you can get up to another 10 or 20%. So tribes could do projects to get up to a 70% tax credit, and they would get a payment from you guys for that tax credit amount. I would combine that, though. I didn't mention RUS, but the RUS, Rural Utility Service, got a $1 billion forgivable loan program through the IRA. And tribes were eligible to apply, and they would get a 60% forgiveness on the loans up to $100 million. And since RUS covers both generation and transmission, it ends up being a way to finance both generation and transmission, get your tax credit, get your forgivable loan, and get your transmission lines built.
Great. Okay, let's go back the other way. Next question is, looking to the future, what either new pending state or federal legislation or federal agency regulation are you sort of most anticipating that you think could potentially be a game changer? So, Pilar?
A repeal of the tax credits. Well, from an Indian country perspective, I will say, not specifically related to transmission, but maybe tangentially, is the BLM's efforts in two things that are underway. One is changing their compensation and leasing regulations for BLM lands for solar and wind, and substantially reducing that compensation. Great. If the Treasury doesn't want to collect any more money from taxpayers who are leasing their land, bad for tribes surrounded by BLM lands. So that Green Link project, for example, that was discussed, skirts 5 tribes going between Las Vegas and Reno, and all on BLM land. And now the BLM's only charging $13 an acre, as opposed to what used to be about $500 an acre. So those tribes along that way now have to compete with people who are only paying $13 an acre on BLM lands. So that's one big issue. And the other is the BLM has expanded their analysis for their solar energy zones. It was 6 states, now it's 11. They've moved it further north. So now they're bringing more tribes into play, so to speak, creating, frankly, a horrible competitive situation between tribes and BLM land. Now it's spread throughout the West. We thought we could contain it to Nevada, but it's now spread throughout the West. So those are the 2 things that we pay attention to, is what our trustee is doing to us in the development of energy.
Okay. Matt, you're next.
Yeah, there's been some legislation introduced in the past year that affects pump storage hydropower projects like what we develop, especially closed loop projects that aren't on any rivers or existing lakes or anything like that. That would help streamline the FERC licensing process, which is pretty onerous for projects that I argue probably shouldn't even be under FERC jurisdiction, because they use really far, far less water than fossil power plants use every year. So that's a different battle. But so we'll be keeping an eye on that legislation and see where that goes.
Great. Masood?
I'll pass this.
Okay. Jennifer?
Yeah, so I'm going to take a slightly different stance on this. It's not legislation, it stems from legislation, but what we've seen, another sort of, progressive thing we've seen in the West outside of due to the lack of an RTO, right? I talked a lot about how we're seeing these different frameworks for trying to address the transmission shortage in the West, coalitions, et cetera. One thing we've seen in states like Colorado and New Mexico is the formation of state transmission authorities. These are state entities. They have bonding authority as well as eminent domain authority. Obviously, they're restricted to building transmission within those state boundaries. So these are smaller lines that are intrastate rather than those more regional interstate lines that we more desperately need. But it's a gap filler, and it's proving effective both in New Mexico and soon in Colorado. Colorado state entity is very new, so they're still getting up and running at this point. What I think is promising there is that there's the opportunity to coordinate across state lines. So even though their authorities are limited by state boundaries, if they can coordinate across state lines, they might be able to get some larger scale transmission built in the future. So I'm encouraged by that.
Great. All right, so now we'll move to some of the audience questions, and anyone on the panel can answer, and more than one person can answer these as well, because I'm sure there'll be different perspectives. So the first one is, what are the prospects for Western transmission growth and grid integration when states like Utah pursue isolationist energy independence policies and fossil fuel preservation mandates as occurred in the recent state legislative session? So you have states that are doing their own policies, going their own ways. How does that work with if you're trying to do a more consolidated plan? I'm guessing Jennifer has some thoughts on this and maybe some others too.
Oh man, I feel like I need to hear that question again.
You can even read it. You're right next to me. Here you go.
Somebody else want to take it first while I try to read the question?
Let me talk about Arizona, since that's where I live. So we're going backwards. We were one of the first states to have a renewable portfolio standard, 15%. We adopted it in 2005 through our Arizona Corporation Commission. It stayed that way. A couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, the ACC looked to try and create a clean energy standard and increase renewables to 50%, clean energy to about 75%. When it came time to vote on it, one of the commissioners flipped their vote and voted down the new plan. So since then, the legislature has repealed our retail choice and deregulation effort that they were underway. They instead have kind of cemented reliability, which is fine. And now in our current legislature, they're proposing to tax the export of solar power from the state to other states. And the ACC is now in the process of repealing our RPS altogether. So we are the number 2 state in the country for solar potential, and we are literally number 12 or 13 in installation. So it's a little embarrassing, but I like to say there's plenty of tribes, plenty of solar, and you don't have to pay any state taxes on our lands, and you don't have to follow state permitting. So just come to Indian country and we'll avoid some of all those issues. And maybe that HVDC line will work from, Tahana Atam to Los Angeles, or maybe I only have to get to Yuma. But that's one of the areas where, we are starting to see in the West. California is a perfect example of it's just cracking up. It's falling apart. Nobody knows what's happening over there. They're repealing net metering. They've got all this crazy stuff going on. Nobody's quite sure. Maybe they've just hit their maximum brain power. But it does seem to be that people take their cues from California. And that seems to me to be starting the breakup of kind of really trying to figure out how, as a group, they can work together, the states can work together. And my dream of Pacific country is getting dashed as we speak. No, I kid.
So, that is the challenge, right? We have there's no RTO in the West, and part of the reason is you have states with very differing policies there, and, the other states are distrustful of sort of California running the show. But on the other hand, the energy imbalance market has saved, billions of dollars, as has already been said. So there's lots of positives that, utilities and customers understand. So, but when we have, states doing their own thing, then sort of what are the prospects of sort of forward movement on that? So either Matt, Jennifer's got an answer now.
Yeah, thank you. I had time to review the question in writing, and that helped me. This is a great question, by the way, because this isolationist approach to, whether it's state policy or just keeping resources within your state, not wanting to share, we see this come up time and time again, particularly in the regional market conversations. Also, and one of my colleagues here that I used to work with at Western Resource Advocates has been steeped in this for many years, but Pacific Corp, which on that map had a 6-state footprint, has this arcane process for allocating costs across their footprint. It's called the multi-state protocol. And there's just this issue with wanting to, states that have the cheaper resources or cheaper prices don't want to sort of give that up to states that have maybe more aggressive clean energy policies. And therefore, maybe some of their customers are paying more for that, right? So we see this isolationist approach coming up in so many different contexts. And so I don't think it's unique to Utah by any means. But what I do think is important, and I think that this speaks volumes no matter what state you're in, whether it's red or blue, and what your clean energy policies look like, or if you don't even have clean energy policies, and that's prices and your economy and what you're paying on your utility bill every month. That speaks volumes to everybody, no matter where you are. And this idea that we can continue building out infrastructure within state boundaries to meet increasing demand, sure, that works. You can do it. And in fact, you can do it more quickly than if you coordinate across a broader footprint. What you don't accomplish under that paradigm is keeping rates lower. We have to build larger scale transmission. We have to be able to share resources across a footprint in order to keep our rates low. So this is the argument that I think is probably the most effective to try to counter some of those isolationist approaches.
Okay, anything from you, Matt? Don't want to leave you out here. You can say no, but you can jump in too. Go ahead.
To follow on that point on economics, a lot of folks blame decarbonization policies for the retirement of coal plants, but a lot of it is just coming down to economics and the cost of operating those. And it may ultimately be that the ever falling prices of renewables will outweigh efforts to sort of ideologically or politically push back on that. So we'll see where that falls.
Great. Okay, so the next question kind of pushes back on the discussion. Basically, you've heard a lot of calls for we need to build lots of large-scale transmission. That is true, but then this question says, is it possible to reduce the need for long-distance transmission lines with their long delays and high cost by vastly expanding rooftop solar on big box stores and parking structures, plus batteries all close to load? So, can we get there? Can we get there close to where we need to get through distributed energy resources, microgrids, that sort of thing? Do we need both? Thoughts from the panelists? Maybe start with Matt and then go to Pilar and then back this way.
Well, I believe in all of the above. So absolutely, look at all the optimized combinations. We haven't talked about energy conservation and energy efficiency much, but it's a huge untapped area, and it starts micro locally and grow out from there. I support that.
Great. Pilar?
Yes, and especially in Indian country, one of the key areas we've seen a lot of growth in is in rooftop solar, community wind, because they're smaller projects, tribes can own them, they can get lots of grants for them. Many tribes have been looking at establishing their own tribal utility authorities. And some of the first things that folks will do, some of the consultants I work with, is they'll say to the tribe, do as much power on your own rooftops or in your own community as you can so that you can import less power into the reservation, because you're going to have to bring power in. So the more you can do locally, the less you have to import. And that imported power is, of course, horribly unreliable for many tribes. They're sitting out in co-op territories or at the end of the line. So it adds a resiliency factor as well. That is greatly, I think, unappreciated. And I usually tease my friends who have big casinos with big parking lots on why am I parking under the sun in Arizona? Why am I not parking under a solar canopy on your parking lot and offsetting the cost of your casino? You can even have like a nice bank of slot machines that say powered by green energy and call them green slots.
That's
And
a good
maybe,
idea.
the Tesla tourist wants to come in because they're environmentally conscious and gamble at the green slot machine. So anyway, there's a marketing effort there too.
I love it. Masood.
Yeah, I agree, but I'd like to also reiterate what Matt mentioned, that it needs to be co-optimized, right? So we still need some larger scale resources. The total, you cannot have the total capacity that you need in the cities, just coming from the rooftop and other distributed resources. But also still you need, so you can do some co-optimization. You can have some local generation, grid interactive building, grid interactive industries. That would help. But also I'd like to bring the attention to the other load growth that is not happening in the cities, right? So all the data centers, all the Bitcoin mining and others that is shocking the grid world, right? So so all the projections of load growth in the next 5 to 10 years is changing across the country because of the data centers that are coming up, because of this Bitcoin's prices going up. So that is affecting, right? So so it should be a mix of it, and it cannot just be distributed, but also mixes of co-optimization of all the resources.
Yep. Jennifer?
Yeah, so I'd agree. I don't think that no matter how much distributed generation we get out there, unfortunately, just based on the more recent studies that I've looked at, it's just not going to be sufficient to meet the need in the future. And so it really does have to be that all of the above strategy that Matt alluded to. And one thing I wanted to note is that we're starting to see this become more prevalent, whether it be at the federal, policy level. But within the context of the regional transmission planning NOPR, I just wanted to highlight one thing that, when we see that final rule, hopefully we're going to see this provision too, but this requirement that these transmission planning groups that I talked about actually consider what I'm going to call non-transmission alternatives in their planning processes. So whether it's non-transmission alternatives or grid enhancing technologies, these are alternatives to actually building out new transmission that can increase the capacity of the existing system. So some examples are dynamic line ratings, advanced power flows. There's plenty of others, but we have this whole sort of toolbox of options for addressing the fact that we don't have enough transmission, that we need more quickly, and we can't build it fast enough. So I don't want to lose that critical point as a part of this discussion.
Great. So that actually introduces very well the next question, which is about dynamic line ratings and other grid enhancing technologies, or GETs. So kind of describing for a question, just asking to describe for the audience and explain how these grid enhancing technologies can help solve the transmission constraints going forward. So I don't know if there's anything more you want to say on that, Jennifer, or then we'll go to Masood and then Pilar and then Matt.
I'd love to know who asked that question. That's an incredibly nerdy one. Right there. Nice. Okay, good. No, I love it. So, I can't rattle it off right away, but thankfully I have some notes prepared. I was ready for this question from you, so thank you. So dynamic line ratings, this is really a technology that allows for so each transmission line is a rating based on sort of ambient conditions, which usually is based on weather. So you can transmit more power across a transmission line in certain weather conditions and less in others. So what a dynamic line rating allows you to do is essentially increase the rating of that line, which allows us to transmit more power across it by using more accurate local weather forecasts and conditions rather than assuming worst case assumptions of the weather. So you're able to increase ratings of existing lines, which is always a good thing. And that's actually been around for a while. Advanced power flows, these would be a set of technologies. So there's numerous within the suite of advanced power flows, but they can either push or pull power away from an overloaded transmission line. So one that's congested and that could potentially go out if it gets too much more transmission added to it. And it can push that power onto underutilized corridors within the same grid. So again, those are just two examples. There are so many more examples we could talk about, but this part of, solving this transmission problem, I think this part of it is really growing, and we are seeing a lot more technologies being developed, which I think is really promising.
Great. Masood.
Such a nice definition. I like it. Yeah, so that basically defined what they are. So as you said, the technology and at least the concepts have been around for 30 years, right? So everybody knows that you can the rate of the transmission line changes with the weather, with the other conditions, but in the utility system, in the energy management system, EMSs, that's constant, right? So how can you better account for that during different conditions, so you can basically utilize more the power grid, utilize more the transmission line? So that includes all the models you need to have, all the weather models you need to have, and all the kind of sensory system you need to have and integrated with the system. But again, to me, that's not a long-term solution. That's a short-term solution that should be part of the equation. That still you have the same transmission line, right? So it's not changing. So you need DLR to better utilize the transmission system. But also on the other side, you have the fax devices. Now they are called GETs, but they used to be fax devices, right? So but that's something that we could utilize to control the flow of the power in the transmission line, and that would definitely help. But to me, they are that's complementary to the other efforts.
Okay, great. We have only a few minutes left, so.
One more.
I can do one more? Okay. I'm going to combine two into one because they're on the same topic. And this is for Pilar. One is, should we prioritize or require transmission lines crossing Indian territory to provide electricity to tribal members? I'm guessing your answer to that is yes, but maybe it's not. And then also on the maps that show the corridors that just skip over tribal lands, how is that possible, and are they planning to go around? A good question. So answer that however you'd like.
Great first question. So some tribes have, in fact, been able to negotiate extension of service lines, maybe not off of the transmission line that's coming through, but by the company whose transmission line. So lots of tribes are serviced by a separate utility. That utility might have transmission lines running through the reservation because they're servicing territories around it. So tribes have been able to negotiate extension of service. I've got a client right now who's negotiating to get onto the line that's coming through because they have a lot of solar potential. They've got some projects in development, and the line that's coming through their reservation is going straight to California. So there are those kinds of negotiations that do take place. The second question, I don't know whether they'll go around or go through. All I know is that there's a gap, and the gap means somebody forgot to talk to the tribe or didn't want to talk to the tribe, or maybe they tried to talk to the tribe. The tribe is 20 years ago, in 2005 when they first put these together. So, but there should not be a gap anymore, and so hopefully they won't go around.
All right. Thank our panelists. Great presentation.
Yes, let me extend on behalf of the Stegner Center our thanks to this panel, but also the panels earlier in the day and the moderators. We're most grateful for your time, your energy, your expertise in sharing all of that with us. Let me also thank once again our principal funders and sponsors, the R. Harold Burton Foundation, who's been a founding donor of the symposium since the outset 29 years ago. The Cultural Vision Fund, that also provides funding for other Stegner Center programs, and the Nature Conservancy of Utah, which has been a friend and a constant supporter for a number of years for the Stegner Center. Tomorrow, we'll get started at 8:30 as we did today, but continental breakfast will be available at 8 o'clock. So let me encourage you to join us. We'll cover the subjects of critical minerals, federal permitting, energy transmission or transition here in Utah, and we'll wrap up with a keynote talk on our energy future. With that, let me thank everyone for joining us today, and have a good evening.